In Erin Entrada Kelly's magical new book, a young girl tests herself against impossible odds to help the people she loves.
There are stories of extraordinary children who are destined from birth to complete great quests and conquer evil villains. Stories of children who find enchanted doors and rabbit holes. This is no such story.
I thought I want to write a heroine who was like I was at 12. My books, I hope, the intention is that young people know that they don't have to be that other person. They don't have to fix something that's not broken. They just have to be the best versions of who they are.
For the readers who see themselves in Lalani and the writer who created her, that gift is more valuable than the riches of the legendary mountain that lies beyond Lalani's island across the distant sea.
When you grow up reading the same characters, you don't even realize that it almost becomes second nature to not see yourself, because you don't even think, they can have dark hair and they can have a parent from another country, but it doesn't even occur to you because you never see it.
When Entrada Kelly won the Newbery Medal in 2018 for her breakthrough novel, Hello Universe, which will soon become a movie, she remembered the shy, sensitive girl who wrote novels in her room to make sense of the world.
I didn't look like the other kids at my school. My hair was black and coarse, my eyes slanted, and over the other kids asked, "What are you?" But that's why we have books, isn't it? So we can meet those people, walk in their shoes, see our reflections, so we can discover that we never struggle alone.
Now for Erin Entrada Kelly, the New York Times bestselling author, the love she gets back from her fans is her reward.
I love doing school visits and going to library events. I've had times when I've been at book signings and kids will just hug me, and it feels, it's the greatest feeling because it means that they feel safe. So the fact that I can become some kind of person, at least in that moment, that they trust is really an incredible honor.
Erin Entrada Kelly, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So the book came out beginning of September, and it's been kind of a whirlwind since then. The reviews have been amazing. You're on tons of lists, and what's that been like?
It's been really overwhelming and very surreal. Anytime you put a book into the world, you never know what's going to happen. And especially because it's my first fantasy, and my other books have been contemporary fiction. You just never quite know, and it can be scary when you're kind of switching direction a little bit. So the fact that it's been so well received and readers have seemed to embrace it and love it it's been really incredible.
Has it been kind of funny to get that much attention too, since writing can be so solitary?
I actually love it a lot because I like to interact, especially with young readers, and they're so full of energy, and I love doing school visits and going to library events. Whenever you're on tour, I think the hardest part is the in-between time, because you get all this energy, especially from the kids, and then when it's over, you're immediately tired again. So it's kind of a roller coaster.
One of the things I notice too, whenever we have a children's author or a middle grade author, is for teachers who are at these events, it's like seeing a rock star for them. You can tell they're even nervous.
That's true. And what's weird is, for me, the educators are the rock stars, because they are the ones who, if they love your book, if they embrace your book, they're the ones who are out there promoting it and supporting it. So it's a very symbiotic relationship. So I always get excited when I see them, and then they get excited when they see authors. So it's very much a symbiotic thing.
So it's a beautiful book. It's just so lyrical and...
Thank you for that. Thank you. That's an incredible compliment.
Tell us about Lalani and Lalani of the Distant Sea, the story and the plot.
So when I sat down and set out to write this book, I thought I want to write a heroine who was like I was at 12. And what I mean by that is a lot of the heroes that we read about they're destined from birth, or they happen upon a rabbit hole or a door that takes them somewhere. And I wanted a character who was not particularly brave, was not particularly extraordinary in her village, just a very ordinary girl. And that describes Lalani. One of the things that is very special about her, though, is that she has this tremendous compassion for the people she loves and for people in general. And so any mission that she sets forth on, especially if there's danger ahead, it will be for reasons outside of herself. So you have Lalani, who is an unlikely heroine because she's a very small 12-year-old girl, and she lives on an island called Cienfuegos that's very oppressed. And the villagers believe that to the north of them, across the distant sea, is another island where all of life's riches are. And so for generations, they've sent their strongest men to cross the sea, and the men never survive. And they usually go and cruise on these big, strong ships. And here's Lalani, the little 12-year-old girl, in a very small scouting boat that can barely navigate the water, who sets forth on this mission. And also in the novel are her best friend Veda, who she calls her Sola, which means soul friend. Veda is very different from Lalani in that she's incredibly practical, and she has the mind of a scientist. And then we have also Veda's younger brother, Hetsby. He's just not a strong boy, which is definitely not something that is valued on the island. So the three of them kind of make up the heartbeat of the novel.
How do you kind of come up with these beautiful lines while you're in there?
For this book, it was a very different process because it is fantasy, so you don't have a ready-made world to draw from, I don't need to explain what school is like because that's obviously we all know what that's like. But for this new world, I have to create the picture for the readers. So I think for this particular one, it was about 15,000 words just of planning beforehand. And then once I have my notebook, because I write all my first drafts by hand, I just start writing. And whatever the manuscript calls for, whether it's figurative language or not a lot of metaphorical language, it just kind of happens and unfolds. Because I've spent so much time already with the world and the story before I ever start writing. So once I start writing, it's already there. It's just getting out of my head and onto the page.
You post some of your notebooks on your website too. How did that start? Was that from the very beginning for you?
Yes. So I started writing when I was about 8 years old, when I was very little. And, I would read books, and then I realized, oh, these are words on paper. So all I need is paper and words, and then I can write my own books. And that's how it all started. Of course, back then, not everyone had a computer in their home or a typewriter. Not that I probably would have used those things anyway, because I was in my room, as I was often as a kid, and just started writing by putting pencil to paper. And to this day, that's how I start on my manuscripts. I feel like the more senses you engage when you're writing, so the sight of the ink, I use different colors ink, the smell of the paper and the ink, and the feel of the pen on the paper, and the sound of the paper turning, all those things I feel like make the process so much more personal. And just sitting down at a computer and writing feels very impersonal to me and cold. I know all writers are different, but I have to have a notebook to start.
It feels more like a creation.
Exactly, yeah. And you can cross things out, you can make notes in the margin, you can draw a doodle if you want, you can draw an arrow and say insert this scene here, and with a computer you're very limited by whatever the program is. But with a notebook you're really not limited at all. And I feel like it's important to engage creativity whenever possible. So that's why I like to use different colored ink. Sometimes I'll turn the page a different direction and write horizontally or write diagonally, just to engage as much creativity as I can.
Do you find too some of your really special lines in a book, maybe those, there's always these sort of tentpole sentences that wake the reader up a bit, or do they come to you more in that process, or while you're actually, doing the pounding of writing?
That's a great question. I think both ways. I think it happens both ways, but probably more so in the notebooks, because usually when I take the notebook and I transfer it onto a computer, what I'm typing in during that first transfer is more teasing out and filling in the holes and growing it. But the bare bones and the bare ideas and the heart is always in that notebook. So those tentpole sentences are probably going to be found more so in that process.
This is also a beautiful book just as an object. The illustrations are gorgeous. How did all that come about?
So I told my editor, I said, I really think this book needs interior illustrations, because you have these little slices of second-person narratives throughout the book. And she agreed. And I have such a great relationship with my publisher and the whole team there at HarperCollins, and they went on the hunt for an illustrator, and they found Leanne Cho, who illustrated the book. And I believe she may have graduated now, but in art school. So she's very much a young, up-and-coming illustrator, and I know we'll see more from her because she's so incredibly talented.
When I started reading, and as each time you're sort of introduced to something that was sort of new and sort of another world, I thought, oh my gosh, like, how do you come up with all this stuff? And then I found on your website, the resource section, where you talk about the roots of Filipino folklore that you kind of began with and built on for this.
Yes. So I knew that I wanted to draw from Philippine mythology and Filipino folklore, but I also knew that I wanted space to make them native to the book as well, and to the world within the book. And I grew up in the States, so I didn't want to necessarily take folklore that was deeply rooted in the Philippines and use that as a direct interpretation. So I took what existed in the mythology, and in many cases, and I used that as almost like a building block to reimagine what this creature would be like in San Laguita and Isa, where Lalani is, and kind of made it something else. A reimagining is what one reader called it, which I like that. Some of the creatures are largely from my imagination, but many of them are rooted in Filipino folklore. And, there's a creature in the book, Tatasa Ulad, who's half eel and half woman. And there are so many cultures that have mermaid folklore and sea creature folklore. So that's one thing about mythology and folklore across cultures. There's so many things that are connected, which I find so interesting. You'll see giants in one culture, you'll see giants in another culture, mermaids, witches, sorcerers, So I definitely used a lot of those Filipino creatures intentionally so that Filipino readers would recognize some of the creatures that they grew up with, and they've really embraced and celebrated the reimagining, which is important to me. So it was a great process to learn about all these creatures, some of whom I'd known before, some I hadn't, and use them as a building block.
How did you grow up with them? You mentioned that storytelling is such a part of Filipino culture.
Yes. So I grew up mostly, my mother is a fantastic storyteller. Now, when I was young and growing up, of course, I didn't want to listen to any of the stories, but I started to appreciate them, of course, as I got older. But she would tell a lot of stories, mostly about her upbringing and growing up in the Philippines. And she also told me many, many saint stories. So my mother's a very devout Catholic, as are many Filipinos. And I mean, to this day, she'll tell me new stories that I hadn't heard before and many that I already have. And one thing that taught me is these stories are so full of pain and suffering, but triumph at the end. And a lot of them have messages of compassion and empathy and not doing things just for oneself, but for a greater purpose, whether it's community or what you believe in, etc. And that lesson, although I'm certainly not as devout a Catholic as my mother, or not even particularly religious, but those lessons, you know, they speak across belief systems, and it's important, right? So those lessons that she taught me have really found their way in each of my books, and in this book as well.
You've talked very candidly about how many of your novels and your characters and stories are rooted in your own childhood experiences of what it felt to be different in a community where everyone really kind of looked the same. You grew up in Louisiana, is that right?
Yes, I grew up in Southwest Louisiana, and the neighborhood where I grew up, you know, there wasn't an immigrant population, and the Asian population was very small, and I was definitely the only Filipino at my school. And it's really difficult because when you're that age, you're already unsure of yourself and self-conscious, and you feel like there's a spotlight on you at all times, and you're embarrassed even when there's nothing to be embarrassed about. And to have the added layer of otherness on top of the otherness that already exists just by being 11 or 12 can be really challenging, especially if you're a kid who is not naturally, what's the word I'm looking for, naturally independent or outspoken. And I was very introspective, and I was a very quiet kid. And so I was always trying to figure out how can I be that kid who is very proud of who they are, and the kid who, you know, volunteers right away when it's time to give a speech in front of the class. You know, how do I be that kid? I could never quite figure it out, but the reason I couldn't figure it out is because I was my own person. And I think young people are always trying to figure out how to be that other kid who seems to be doing it better or seems to know what's going on, when really nobody knows what's going on. And my books, I hope, the intention is that young people know that they don't have to be that other person. They don't have to fix something that's not broken. They just have to be the best versions of who they are.
You receive a lot of communication from your young readers, and they come up to you at your signings, et cetera, and you've talked about the fact that you've had a lot of kids say things to you about that.
It actually makes me feel very, very special that young people trust me and feel safe to tell me things. You know, I've had times when I've been at book signings and kids will just hug me, you know, and it feels, it's the greatest feeling because it means that they feel safe. And a lot of kids don't often feel safe, you know. Even kids that are in loving homes, you know, don't always feel comfortable talking to their parents. So, you know, it doesn't necessarily mean they have a bad family life, right? If they don't want to, if they don't want to speak up. I had one young reader tell me that her mother was upset at one of my books because why don't the kids just go talk to their parents and then everything would be fine? But and I think, well, that's strange because that's not what really happens in life. Even if you have parents that are very good parents and very present, that's not something that kids will hurry up and do. Like,
you don't want to worry your parents.
Yeah, because when you're a kid, you don't want to be a burden. You don't want to worry them. You want them to be proud of you as well. And you don't want to admit to your parents, for example, that you're being bullied or that you're embarrassed of something, because you want them to be proud of you. So the fact that I can become some kind of person, at least in that moment, that they trust, is really an incredible honor.
At what point in your own life did you start to realize these things that made you feel sort of different and you know, insecure were going to become your superpower later on?
it definitely started, I would say, when I became a parent, so I have a daughter. And anyone who has children know that when you have a child, it completely changes your worldview. And I thought, I want to teach my daughter to be proud of who she is. I want to teach her to speak up for herself. I want to teach her to be all the things that I felt like I wasn't, because parents always want their kids to be better than them. But how am I going to teach those things if I haven't embraced those things yet? So I think it took maturity. I think it took a different mindset, a different perspective. I think it took hindsight, because you look back and you think, oh, that wasn't important at all. At the time, it's very important, and adults will tell you, oh, you won't worry about this in a few years, but until those few years happen, it's very important to you. So I think it took all those things. Yeah.
I think one of the things too, you realize that going through that yourself taught you compassion and just how valuable that is. And that's something you've talked a lot about as a quality that's important in your characters.
Yes, because I feel like, when I was growing up, it felt like a liability to be so sensitive. I was sensitive about myself. I was sensitive about toward others. My feelings would get hurt easily, and I would feel embarrassed or hurt for other people. And it was a very difficult way to go through life, because you're sensitive. You're overly sensitive to everything. So it certainly did not feel like a strength or something to be proud of. But as I've gotten older and seen the things that we celebrate in our society, which aren't always the things we should be celebrating, it makes me realize that young people absolutely need to know that kindness and compassion and empathy are the root of humanity and what set us apart. And those things should be championed. And being the loudest and the most braggadocious, or all these other things, that extroverted qualities that we tend to value, the other side of that is also equally valuable. The quiet but mighty.
What did help you persevere and hang in there through those years?
Honestly, it was writing in books, because no matter what was going on in my life, I knew that one day, I didn't know, but I felt like I knew. One day, I'm going to write books, and people are going to read my books, and none of this will matter anymore, because I'm going to follow my dream. And anytime I got really depressed, which was often as an adolescent, I would think about that. I would think it was my escape to say, okay, well, one day this is going to happen, and one day I'm going to move away from here and live in New York City. Of course, I never moved to New York City, but when you're a kid, that's the dream, right? I'm going to live in New York City, and I'm going to be a big famous author. So really, books really did save me.
You had your daughter at a young age when a lot of kids are still, not kids, but young people are still figuring out their career path, and you were kind of juggling both.
Yes. So I was a single mother, and I had my daughter. I was only 19. And so I was raising her, going to school, college, and working. And it took me 10 years to get my bachelor's degree, because I could only take a class here and there. And what's funny is I never really thought of it as perseverance. It was just kind of that's what you do to get where you want to go. And but looking back on it, of course, I also had a very strong support system, which is also very important. But looking back on it, I think, wow, how did I do all that stuff? I'm still not sure, but yeah. But even to this day, I tend to have a lot of things going on, and maybe that's. Yeah, one day I'll probably have a fabulous breakdown, but for right now, I just like to have a lot of things going on, and maybe that's what helped me.
Be productive.
Right.
Do you remember the first time you read a book that had an Asian character?
Oh boy, I think it was probably Judy Blume had a book just as long as we're together. And one of the main character's friends was Asian. I think that was the first one that I can remember.
So what you remember more is that there weren't any.
Right. I'm sure there were, but I didn't encounter them. They weren't readily available as, maybe some other books were.
And how did that feel to you? I mean, were you craving?
You know what's funny? I think when you grow up reading the same characters, you don't even realize that it almost becomes second nature to not see yourself in books or TV or movies. And it's almost not until it kind of goes back to that self-awareness where either something wakes you up to it or you see one and then you realize, oh, wait a minute, all the characters that I drew in books whenever I was a kid, they were all like Elizabeth and Jessica Wakefield in Sweet Valley High.
I read those too.
Those were what they looked like, and a lot of authors will say the same thing because you don't even think, they can have dark hair and they can have a parent from another country, but it doesn't even occur to you because you never see it.
What would it have meant to you to have these choices of books?
Oh, it would have been a game changer. I don't know that it would have solved all of life's problems, but it would have been something to have that moment, because we all have these books, the moments in books where it feels like we have a secret and the author has figured it out and shares it with us, and you think, oh my gosh, I thought I was the only one who felt this way or thought this way. So to think about relating to a character that way, it would have been amazing.
And now to think your books are those books, that's got to be.
It's very surreal. It's really hard to explain. But it's surreal, I would say. That's the best word.
When I look at your interviews and anything where you've given speeches, you seem so grateful for your life and what you're getting to do. It just comes across just a sort of level of joy and contentment that you are doing exactly what you feel like you were put here to do.
Thank you for that. I hope it does come across, because I am joyful and grateful and appreciative, and I try not to take myself too seriously, and I try to realize the gifts that I have. And I think about that little 8-year-old girl who, said, one day I'm going to write a bestseller and I'm going to be just like Judy Blume. And not that I'm just like Judy Blume. I don't. Please don't, Judy Blume, don't come after me. Judy Blume.
Right. I know, even saying her name, you feel like,
but to think that was my goal, and now I'm out here, that's why I love book signing so much with young people, because I think someone actually has this book, especially when the kids, you sign it, and a lot of kids will pick it up and they'll hug it as they're walking away, and they're so happy. And just to think, wow, my signature means something to someone that much. I try never to lose sight of that, and I hope I never do. There's days when I'm just walking around and I think, wow, I won the Newbery Medal. How did that happen? And years from now, I hope I'm still doing that, because, I never want to lose sight of how fortunate I am. And so, yeah, thank you for that.
Thank you so much, Erin Entrada Kelly, for joining us. It's been so nice to talk to you.
Thank you.